February 1945, the island of Guam. A young naval officer steps off a plane carrying a sealed letter. His orders are simple: put it in one man's hands and no one else's. That man is Chester Nimitz, commander of the largest fleet ever put to sea. He opens the letter, and he reads that the United States is building a single bomb meant to end the war. It could be ready by August, 6 months away. Nimitz looks up. He is not impressed. "This is February," he says, "and you're talking about the 1st of August. He is fighting a war right now, and he does not believe he needs 6 more months, or that bomb, to win it. Because by the summer of 1945, Chester Nimitz already has Japan by the throat. He has found a way to end this war. It is already working, and it will never be his to finish. What Nimitz had planned for Japan's last months would have ended the war without a single atomic bomb, and it has been all but forgotten. This is what he was about to do, and why Washington chose a different way. Japan was a nation built on water it did not own. Everything it needed came across the sea: the oil to run its engines, the iron and coal to feed its factories, the rice to feed its people. Even its own soldiers, moved from one home island to the next, rode on ships. It was an empire that floated, and a floating empire can be sunk. By 1945, much of that sinking had already been done, and done quietly, beneath the waves. For 3 years, American submarines had hunted the Japanese merchant fleet across the Pacific and torn the heart out of it. Tanker by tanker, freighter by freighter, they had cut the long ocean supply lines until more than half of Japan's army sat stranded and useless on the mainland of Asia, unable to get home for want of ships to carry it. But the submarines could only reach so far. They worked the deep water, the open sea. They could not slip into the shallow home channels, the crowded inland straits, the narrow mouths of the harbors where the water turned tight and treacherous. And that was exactly where the last of Japan still moved. Almost all of it now passed through a few narrow, crowded stretches of water close to shore. The inland sea, penned in among Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, and above all one gateway, the Shimonoseki Strait, the thin seam of water where the traffic of an entire empire squeezed into a channel a man could very nearly see across. Close that water, and Japan did not have to be invaded. It would simply stop. The factories would fall silent for want of ore. The kitchens would go empty for want of rice. An island nation would starve on its own doorstep. Nimitz saw this clearly. Long before the summer of 1945, he had settled on the way to beat Japan. It was not to storm ashore into the guns. It was to lock the doors of the sea and wait for the country behind them to run out. This was not a whim. It was the fruit of a lifetime. For decades between the wars, the Navy had studied one problem harder than any other: what a war with Japan would look like and how it would be won. The men who came out of that long study, Nimitz among them, had reached a conviction they held in their bones: that the home islands could be beaten from the sea, and that landing an army on those islands into a nation that would fight to the last child was a road to a butcher's bill no free country should ever want to pay. They had spent 20 years learning that lesson on paper. Now Nimitz meant to prove it in salt water, but to reach that shallow inshore water, he needed something the submarines could not give him. He needed aircraft. And in November 1944, he went looking for them in a place the Navy did not usually go begging. He went to the Army Air Forces. The B-29 Superfortress was their crown jewel, a machine built and guarded for one purpose: to fly high over Japan and burn the war out of its cities. The men who flew it thought in terms of factories and rail yards, of fire and rubble, of targets you could see from 20,000 feet. Nimitz wanted some of those bombers for something the airmen considered beneath the airplane. He wanted them to come down low, out over the water at night and drop mines. Henry Arnold, who ran the Army Air Forces, did not care for the idea. Mine-laying was a Navy chore in his view, not the proper work of a strategic bomber. There was resistance, and there was pride, and there were only ever so many airplanes to go around. Nimitz pushed anyway. He threw the full weight of his command into the argument, and he would not let it drop. Arnold gave way. Partly, he agreed to lend the effort to Curtis LeMay's bomber command, and LeMay, once he looked hard at what mines could actually do to a country that lived and died by the sea, did not do it by halves. He took the modest campaign that had been asked of him and, on his own authority, tripled it. So it came to pass that the Air Force's proudest weapon was handed, in part, to an admiral's quiet plan to strangle Japan from the sea. On the night of March 27, 1945, it began. Off the coral runways of Tinian, the bombers of the 313th Wing lifted into the dark, heavy and slow, and turned north. They carried no fire for the cities that night. They carried mines, and these were not simple mines. Some woke to the magnetic signature of a steel hull passing overhead. Some listened for the sound of engines and screws in the water. Some waited for the change in pressure a moving ship pushes ahead of itself. A minesweeper could clear one kind and sail a ship straight onto another. There was no easy way to sweep them all. The bombers flew low. They flew alone, one aircraft at a time, guided by radar to the mouths of Japan's harbors and the seams of its straits. Picture one of those nights. A single superfortress, meant to fly high and safe, brought down to a few hundred feet over enemy water in the dark. The radar man hunched over his screen, calling the run, the searchlights swinging up from the shore, the mines dropping away by parachute, one after another, to settle unseen into the channel below. And then the long, lonely turn for home over a black ocean, with hours of open water still to cross before Tinian. They did that again and again, night after night, until the sea lanes of the home islands were sown with thousands upon thousands of them. Over the months that followed, the crews laid something on the order of 12,000 mines into Japanese waters, and the sea began to close. Look at the Shimonoseki Strait, that gateway an empire depended on. In March, some 70,000 tons of shipping still pushed through it each day. By May, that had collapsed to 7,500. By August, barely 1,500. The gate was shutting, week by week, and no one in Japan could pry it open again. Look at the great port of Kobe. In March, better than 300,000 tons of shipping moved through it. By July, it was down to 44,000. More than 4/5 of it, gone. Across the home islands, 35 of Japan's 47 most vital shipping routes were simply given up, left empty, too deadly to use. The ships that struck a mine and somehow survived limped toward the repair yards, and found the approaches to those yards mined too, nearly all of them blocked. The wounded could not even crawl in to be healed. By the end, this campaign of mines had sunk or damaged more than 900 Japanese ships, close to 2 million tons of hulls. In those final months, this one effort accounted for the majority of every ton Japan lost at sea, and it did it on a shoestring. Weigh it against the submarines, that whole force of them, close to 200 boats, that had hunted Japan for 3 years. Ship for ship, per aircraft in the water each night, this handful of mining bombers was pulling down Japanese tonnage at a rate that matched the submarines, and even edged past them. A few dozen airplanes doing the work of a navy. The choke reached even the enemy's warships. By that summer, what was left of the once proud Japanese fleet sat tied up in its own harbors, unable to steam for want of fuel the tankers could no longer bring in. A navy that had struck at Pearl Harbor now rode at anchor, rusting, because the oil to move it lay at the bottom of the sea or trapped 1,000 miles away behind a wall of American mines and submarines. And you could see the result on the plates of the Japanese people. Their fishing fleet, hemmed into the shallows, brought in a 1945 catch that was barely a fifth of what it had been before the war. The rice harvest was the worst the country had seen in more than 30 years. Hunger spread through the home islands like a slow tide, and the enemy could not clear it. They sent out their sweepers and worked the channels, but the mines had been built to defeat exactly that. Sweep for the magnetic kind, and a ship still ran onto the ones that listened for sound. Clear those, and the pressure mines waited for the swell of a passing hull. A channel declared safe at dawn could kill a freighter by dusk. Crews stopped trusting the water under their own keels. Pilots refused runs. Harbors that had fed an empire for 1,000 years simply stopped taking ships. The enemy measured it in his own way. The officer who had charge of Japan's minesweeping said, after it was all over, that this campaign alone might have brought his country to its knees had the Americans only begun it sooner. That is what Nimitz's way was doing to Japan. Not on a map, not in a plan on a shelf. In the water, in real time, that very summer. And he was no lone voice with a stubborn theory. Raymond Spruance, one of the hardest fighting admirals America had, the man slated to command the opening of any invasion, had told Nimitz plainly what he would rather do: not land at all. Let the enemy wither on the vine, the way whole island garrisons had already been left cut off and starving across the ocean. Two of the toughest men the country had in that theater, both arriving at the same cold arithmetic. You did not have to bleed for Japan's beaches. You could close the sea and let the sea do the work. I have read the tonnage tables from that summer, and what stays with me is not how much went to the bottom. It is how quietly a whole country was being shut, one strait at a time, by a man most of its people never saw. The bombers that were closing that sea flew from Tinian, and Tinian was Nimitz's, down to the Coral. His Marines and soldiers had taken the Marianas in the summer of 1944, Saipan, then Guam, then Tinian, at a cost their families never forgot. That blood is why the runways were there at all. The Seabees had come in behind the riflemen and carved the biggest airfield of the war out of the cane fields and coral. And from those runways, the B-29s could finally reach the heart of Japan. Nimitz's ocean campaign had built the very airstrips the whole endgame would fly from. And out of one of those airfields, night after night, his mining crews went to their work of closing the sea. By the summer of 1945, Tinian had become something the world had never seen. Its airfield had grown so vast, its runways and roads laid out on such a grid, that the men who lived there took to naming its avenues after the streets of New York, as though they had built a small steel city in the middle of the Pacific. For a time it was the busiest airfield on Earth. Bombers left it in streams, bound for Japan, around the clock. It was, in every sense that mattered, a creation of Nimitz's war, and somewhere in that steel city, off in a fenced corner of its own, sat the one thing on the island that did not belong to him. Then, in the late spring of 1945, a new group came to the same field. It was folded onto the roster of the very same wing, the 313th, the mining wing. On paper, it was only a fifth group added to the four already there, but this one was different. It kept to itself, on its own patch of ground at the north tip of the island, its own fences, its own guards, its own handful of aircraft parked well apart from everyone else's that no one was permitted to walk up to and look at. It took almost nothing from the wing it supposedly belonged to. It drew its own supplies, kept its own counsel, and answered quietly to men far away in Washington, not to anyone on that island, and not to Nimitz. How closed off was it? There is a story from Tinian that tells you everything you need to know. The general who commanded the whole wing, the man in charge of all of it, walked over one day to have a look at those special, cordoned-off airplanes, and a sentry stopped him. Turned him around. He did not have the right pass. Consider what that means. The commanding general of the wing could not get near the aircraft parked inside his own command. The secret was that tightly held. It sat behind a wall that even his own generals were not allowed to cross. The men laying Nimitz's mines knew none of it. They flew their runs, closed the sea a little more each night, and never learned that the thing which would truly end their war was sleeping a few miles up the same island, behind guards who would turn away a general. If men like those crews are worth remembering, the ones who flew the missions no one ever named a movie after, who strangled an empire from the cockpit of a bomber in the dark, take 1 second right now and press the like button. It is a small thing, but it tells more people that this story is still worth telling. Because here is what was true on that island in the summer of 1945. 2 ways to end the same war sat within a few miles of each other. One was patient. It worked by pressure, by hunger, by the slow closing of the sea. And it was already winning. The other would need a single morning. They shared an island, they shared a wing, they did not share a commander. On paper, none of this made Nimitz a bystander. On paper, he was still going to invade. In the middle of May 1945, his staff and Douglas MacArthur's staff sat down together in Manila and built the plan for it. The invasion of Japan had a name: Downfall. Its opening blow, the landing on the southern island of Kyushu, had a name of its own: Olympic. And it had a date: the 1st of November, 1945. Nimitz put his concurrence on it. On the record, he was in. He had reason to feel the pressure behind that plan. That spring, the men who weighed such things in Washington had warned the Joint Chiefs of something grim. Japan, they said, would not be forced to surrender on any terms America could accept. Not before the middle of the following year, unless American soldiers set foot on the home islands and fought for them. In other words, wait, and the war might drag deep into 1946. The Army heard that and reached for the fastest answer it knew: a landing, get ashore, get it over with, before the country's patience ran dry. Some of the numbers put forward for that landing were almost gentle. MacArthur's own casualty estimates for the invasion came in so low that they scarcely seemed to count the Navy's losses at all, as though the fleet would simply stand offshore and watch. Other men, closer to the truth, put the figure somewhere else entirely. In a private letter, one general reckoned the dead among the invading force might climb toward 500,000. 500,000 American families waiting on a telegram. And no one truly knew, because no army had ever tried to land on a nation of 100 million people prepared to die in the ditches and the dooryards to stop them. The estimates ran from the hopeful to the horrifying, and the gap between them was measured in the sons of ordinary towns. Nimitz knew better than to trust the gentle numbers, because something had been working on him, and it had a name too: Okinawa. That spring, off Okinawa, his fleet had met the kamikaze at the very height of its fury. Young men flying airplanes straight into the sides of American ships, trading their lives for a fire on a flight deck. Across the whole kamikaze campaign, from the autumn of 1944 through that summer, better than 300 American ships were struck that way. More than 7,000 American sailors and their comrades never came home from it. And nowhere was it worse than off Okinawa. The worst of it fell on the small ships, the destroyers stationed far out on the radar picket lines, posted alone at the edge of the fleet to give warning of the raiders coming in. They were the first thing the kamikaze found, and they took blow after blow meant for the carriers behind them. Some of those little ships were hit again and again in a single day, their crews fighting fires and manning guns until there was almost nothing left to stand on, and still they held the line. Nimitz watched his ships burn from a weapon his sailors could not shoot down fast enough. And it did not break him. It sharpened him. It set him counting. He looked at what a landing on Japan itself would truly cost. Not a beaten garrison on some far atoll, a whole nation, ready to die on its own soil, with the kamikaze waiting in their hundreds over the invasion fleet. And he ran the numbers on his own men. His estimate for the sailors alone came to something near 5,000 American dead. His sailors. On top of everything the beaches would cost the soldiers and the Marines who waded into them. He had held the line at Midway once, when the odds said run. He was not a man who flinched from a fight, but he was also not a man who would spend 5,000 of his own sailors on a landing he had come to believe the country no longer needed. And so, at the end of May, Chester Nimitz did a quiet and extraordinary thing. Privately, he told his own superior, Admiral King in Washington, that he could no longer support an invasion of Japan at all, set that against the plan he had just signed. In the very same stretch of days, on the record, he was helping to build the landing. Off the record, he had turned against it in his heart. He would go on planning the thing he had decided must not happen, because he had been ordered to plan it, and because he had counted the graves and could not put his whole faith behind it any longer. That is the man, not a chest thumper, not a general spending other men's sons for the glory of a beach. A commander who would do his duty on paper and tell the truth in private and carry the full weight of both at once. He was not entirely alone in the doubt. The old admiral who sat at the president's own elbow believed an invasion neither necessary nor wise. Others in the Navy's high command thought Japan was already finished and needed only to be squeezed a while longer. But there was a difference between doubting a plan from a desk in Washington and being the man who would have to send the fleet in to make it happen. Nimitz was that man. The 5,000 were his to lose. And he had decided, quietly, that he would not lose them if there were any other road. There was another road. He was already on it, out in the water, every single night. His way, the sea, the mines, the slow strangling, was the way that spared those men, and it was already happening in the water, while the planners argued over the beaches. Then, in the first days of August, Washington reached past all of it. Behind closed doors, the fight over the invasion had grown desperate. The picture of what a landing on Kyushu would really cost had turned so dark that even the Navy's top man in Washington, Admiral King, moved to kill the operation outright. He fixed on the 9th of August to force the issue, to walk into the room and try to cancel Olympic altogether. He never got to finish that fight. Events outran him, because out of that same field on Tinian, the walled-off group finally flew. 1 B-29, one morning. A weapon that had arrived on a sealed letter 6 months before. That had sat behind guards who would turn away a general. That had never, for a single day, belonged to the admiral whose island it flew from. And within days, the thing that Nimitz's minds were closing in on slowly, the surrender of Japan, came all at once. It came in a rush that still astonishes. In the space of a single week, every pressure that had been building on Japan for months seemed to arrive together. The sea was shut. The cities were burning. The Soviet Union threw its armies across the border in the north. And out of Tinian came the 2 flights from that walled-off corner of the island. What Nimitz's blockade had been doing by patient degrees, the events of that 1 week did in a matter of hours. The empire that had refused every call to surrender folded in on itself, and the guns of the Pacific fell silent at last. For Nimitz, it must have been the strangest kind of victory. Everything he had built was still running at full stride, the sea still tightening, the fleet still bearing down, when the war he had all but won was simply lifted out of his hands and finished. The landing his staff had drawn up for the 1st of November was never launched. The greater invasion meant to follow it, the drive toward Tokyo set for the spring of 1946, never came. The 5,000 sailors Nimitz had counted did not die off those beaches. The soldiers and marines who would have gone ashore into the guns boarded ships for home instead. His mines were still in the water when it ended, still doing their patient, silent work, still sinking the last ships of an enemy that was already strangling, finishing, in the dark, a war that had just been ended in the daylight by another hand entirely. The man who had a working way to end the war watched it end another way. He showed the world no bitterness over it. He was a professional to the marrow of his bones, but the fact of it sat there all the same, quiet and enormous. He had found the door and laid his hand on the latch, and someone else, from his own island, with a weapon out of his reach, had simply blown out the wall beside it. On the 2nd of September 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the war came to its formal end aboard the battleship Missouri. The bay was crowded with ships, his ships. The fleet he had built and driven across 3,000 miles of ocean, now riding at anchor in the enemy's own home waters. There could be no plainer picture of who had won the sea. On the deck that morning stood the men who had run the war, and across from them the envoys of a beaten empire, come to put their names to the end of it. Above them, the guns of the great battleship. Around them, filling the bay to the horizon, the gray steel of a fleet that had fought its way home to the enemy's own front door. And when the moment came for the United States to sign the instrument of surrender, it was Chester Nimitz who stepped forward and put his name to it. Consider the shape of that. He had fought the Air Force to borrow its bombers. He had launched them from an island his own men had bled to take. He had used them to close the sea around Japan until the country could barely feed itself. That was his war, and it had all but won it. And the war ended when a different bomber, from that same island, running under orders that never passed through his hands, did in one morning what his sea was doing over many months. He did not drop it. He had been told of it, and waved it off, and gone on with his own plan. And then he signed for the peace it helped to bring. The victory was placed in his hand. The weapon that sealed it never was. But let no one tell you his way did not matter. When the war was over, and the men whose job it was to weigh such things went back through the wreckage of Japan, they reached a hard conclusion. The sea campaign, the blockade, the mines, the slow closing of the water, had been strangling Japan so completely that, begun earlier and pressed harder, it might well have forced the surrender on its own, without a landing, without a bomb. The Navy's own reading of the intelligence that summer had already pointed the same way. The invasion everyone dreaded was becoming, in the cold light of the facts, very nearly unthinkable. There was less and less left to invade. He knew it, too. In the weeks that followed, in public and before the Congress itself, he spoke his plain mind about sea power and the war just won. He would not make light of the terrible new weapon. It had surely hastened the end, but in his own judgment, Japan had already been brought to its knees before that August morning ever came, beaten by the fleet, by the submarines, by the mines, by the slow closing of the sea, around a nation that could not live without it. There is a lesson buried in all of it that we have half forgotten. We remember the summer of 1945 for a single blinding morning, and we should. But the other half of that summer, the quieter half, proved something just as large, that a great and stubborn enemy could be brought to the edge of collapse without a single soldier setting foot on its soil. Beaten not in one stroke, but by patience, by pressure, by the slow and relentless closing of the sea. Nimitz had built that proof with his own hands, in salt water, and it stood. His war did not get the last word, but it had earned one. So remember, when you think back on the summer of 1945, the men who made that possible. Remember the crews who flew out over the black water to lay the mines that no history book ever put on its cover. Remember the sailors off Okinawa who took the kamikaze on their own decks so that a hard old admiral could do honest arithmetic about the cost of a beach. And remember Chester Nimitz himself, the man who planned an invasion he had already resolved in his heart to spare his men from, who found a way to beat Japan by closing the sea, and who then stood on the deck of the Missouri and signed for a peace that had come by another road. He won the ocean. And the ocean was won by a whole generation of Americans whose names never made the papers. A great many of you watching had a father or a grandfather in that ocean, on a destroyer off Okinawa, in a bomber over the inland sea, on a work crew on some island he was never allowed to say much about, even long after he came home. Some of what they did never made it into the record at all. It lived at a kitchen table, in a story told once, late, when the coffee had gone cold and the old guard came down for a minute. If you carry one of those stories, something he told you that the history never wrote down, put it in the comments below. Just a line, where he served, what he saw, what he never spoke of until the day he finally did. That is how it survives. That is how we keep it. They closed the sea and won a war, and most of them never asked to be remembered for it. The least we can do is refuse to forget. The 30th of September, 1942. A B-17 dropped out of the clouds over a small island in the Solomons and lined up on a strip of dirt called Henderson Field. The runway below was pocked with craters. The night before, Japanese warships had stood off the coast and shelled it in the dark. The night after, they would come back and do it again. No one on that island could tell you how much longer they would hold it. And when the bomber rolled to a stop and the hatch opened and a man in a rumpled khaki uniform climbed down into the mud, the Marines who saw him did not quite believe it. Because the man standing in the dirt, in the smell of burned aviation fuel and cordite, was Chester Nimitz, the commander of the entire United States Pacific Fleet. He ran everything. Every carrier, every battleship, every submarine, every man in uniform across the widest ocean on Earth answered, in the end, to him. He was the single most important American in the entire Pacific. And there was a reason men that important did not go to places like this. If he fell here, one bomb in the night, one shell off a passing warship, one lucky Japanese pilot, the United States would lose the mind that was running the whole war on that side of the world. At the exact moment, the war was closest to being lost. Every rule of command said he should be somewhere safe, far to the rear, moving fleets around a map. He had no reason to be standing in this particular mud. 1,000 miles to the south, on a ship anchored in a quiet harbor at Noumea, was the officer who actually commanded this operation. That man worked for Nimitz, and in almost 2 months of fighting, that man had never once set foot on the island. His own orders were deciding. The one who was safe stayed away. The one with the most to lose flew in and put his boots in the dirt. Why? Why would the one man who could not afford to die put himself in the one place where he might? The answer is not the one you would expect. He did not come for the danger, and he did not come to prove anything. He came for one thing he needed so badly he was willing to bet his own life to get it. One thing that no report, no dispatch, no message sent back to Noumea or to Pearl Harbor could ever give him. And what he found in a few hours on that island would change how the United States fought the rest of the war. What Nimitz flew into that day had started 7 weeks earlier. The Marines had landed on Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, first American ground offensive of the war. They came ashore, they took the half-built airfield, and then, 2 days later, the Navy left them. It was not planned that way, but the aircraft carriers covering the landing pulled back early. Their commander feared losing them to Japanese air power that had already shown what it could do. Without carriers overhead, the transport ships unloading on the beach had no protection. Their commander made the only choice he felt he could make. He pulled them out too, and they pulled out with their holds still full: food, ammunition, barbed wire, heavy construction equipment. Half the supplies the Marines were supposed to have were still sitting in the bellies of those ships when the ships sailed away over the horizon. That same night, in the black water just off the island, the Navy fought a battle it would spend years trying to forget. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom in a fight that lasted barely half an hour. The stretch of sea where they sank would earn a name from the men who fought over it in the months to come. They called it Iron Bottom Sound, for the sheer number of ships that came to rest on the floor of it. So the Marines were left, on a patch of jungle they barely knew, cut off from the sea. On reduced rations, counting their bullets, digging in around a half-finished airfield with whatever they had managed to carry ashore before the ships left. They were the first American ground troops to take the offensive in the entire war, and in the second week of it, they were, for all practical purposes, on their own. And for 6 weeks, they held. They held through the shelling. Almost every night, Japanese warships slipped down the channel between the islands and stood off the coast and fired into the airfield, and the men dug in around it. Big naval guns, throwing shells the size of a man, into the dark, at troops who could do nothing but press themselves into the earth and wait for it to stop. The Marines gave the nightly visitors a name. They called them the Tokyo Express. And they came, and came, and came. They held through the sickness. Malaria moved through the ranks like a second enemy, quieter than the first, and, in the end, more effective at it. It ran men's temperatures up past 104. It put more Marines flat on their backs than Japanese bullets did. A man could be shivering with fever in the morning and still be expected to hold his section of the line that night, because there was no one to replace him. They held on food they took off the enemy. When their own rations ran short, the Marines ate captured Japanese rice out of captured Japanese stores and were glad to have it. They held because a Marine general named Alexander Vandegrift had decided, quietly and without drama, that they would. And because the men in the foxholes had decided the same thing, one foxhole at a time. But holding is not the same as winning. Every night the Express came back was another night the men had simply not lost yet. And from the outside, from the charts and the message traffic 1,000 miles away, it did not look like holding at all. It looked like a slow bleed on an island nobody back home had heard of, in a place the country was not sure was worth the cost. Because the man in command of the whole operation was reading about it from far away and never came any closer. He ran it from a cabin on a transport ship anchored at Noumea. He read the dispatches that came in, he answered them, he sent his own back up the line to Pearl Harbor, and the messages that went up were heavy with worry. They asked for more. They said the men were barely hanging on. They carried the sound of a man who was not sure this could be done. He had never seen the island those dispatches described. He was a careful officer, doing the job the way he had been taught to do it, from the chart, from the message traffic, from the reports stacked on his desk. He had spent a long career learning to read a battle through the words other men sent him. It had served him well enough for 30 years. But the words were not telling the truth, not because anyone was lying, because a report cannot carry what a place feels like when you are standing in it. It cannot carry the weight in a tired man's voice, or the look on the face of a general who has not slept in a week. It flattens everything down to lines on a page, and the lines were not enough. No one at the top had stood on the ground the lines described, and so no one at the top could tell how much of the fear in those messages was the island, and how much was the man sending them. Those same dispatches crossed another desk. Chester Nimitz read every one of them at Pearl Harbor, in the quiet of his headquarters, thousands of miles from the fighting. And Nimitz could not get the truth out of them either. They contradicted each other. One message said the situation was desperate. The next said the airfield was holding. They asked for reinforcements, and then they asked again, and the asking had a tone to it that a careful reader could not miss, a tone of a man who was running out of confidence faster than he was running out of men. They were soaked in worry, and worry is not information. Worry cannot be planned against. Nimitz needed to know one thing, and it was the single biggest question in the Pacific that autumn. Could Guadalcanal actually be held? Or was it time to admit the thing could not be done, pull the Marines off that island while there was still a way to pull them off, and put American strength somewhere it might do more good? Thousands of lives hung on the answer. So did the shape of the whole war in the Pacific. If Guadalcanal fell, the Japanese would have their airfield back, and the long supply line to Australia would sit under the shadow of it. If it held, it became the first place the tide had ever turned against Japan on the ground, and the man who had to make that call could not get a straight answer out of the paper on his desk. Washington was already arguing about it. The Secretary of the Navy told a reporter he was not sure the island could be saved. Officers on General MacArthur's staff were saying, quietly, that it might be smarter to pull out of Guadalcanal altogether and put American strength somewhere else. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had read the same paper. Nimitz did not decide on paper. He decided to go and see it himself. Now, look at what that meant. This was not a general touring a quiet rear area. Guadalcanal at the end of September was an active battlefield, contested in the air, contested at sea, shelled after dark. And Nimitz did not send word ahead and wait for the island to be made safe for him. He was already moving through the South Pacific on an inspection of the whole theater, seeing it for himself, base by base. Guadalcanal was the place he most needed to stand on, so he went to it. He was putting the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet onto the most dangerous piece of ground in the ocean, and the men around him understood exactly what that risk was. That the loss of Nimitz would be a blow the enemy could not have won for themselves in a year of fighting. He went anyway, because there was no other way to get the one thing he had come all that distance for. There's a reason stories like this one don't make the history books. The men who lived them rarely talked about them afterward. If you believe they still deserve to be remembered, take a second and hit that like button. That's all I ask. The bomber came down onto Henderson Field, and Chester Nimitz stepped into the mud. He had come at a hard moment, into a place that had nearly come apart only days before. 2 weeks earlier, on a low, bare ridge just south of the airfield, the Marines had fought off one of the worst attacks of the entire campaign. The Japanese had come at that ridge in the dark, in wave after wave, through 2 nights, and at the worst of it the fighting had rolled back so far that it reached almost to the edge of Vandegrift's own command post. A few hundred Marines had held that rise against thousands. When it was over, the ground in front of their positions told the story of how close it had been. They called that piece of ground Edson's Ridge, after the officer who commanded the men on it. The men who had held it were still there when Nimitz arrived. So were the marks of what it had cost them. He could have stayed near the runway, where it was as safe as anywhere on the island got. He could have taken the briefing and turned around. Instead, he went to the ridge. He walked the ground where the line had almost broken. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has to understand, and knows he cannot understand from a chart. He saw with his own eyes how thin the line had been, how few men had stood on that rise, and how many had come at them. He saw the field in front of the positions. He saw the exhausted Marines still holding it, gaunt from short rations, yellow-skinned from malaria, running on nothing but the flat refusal to give the ground up. No dispatch had ever made him feel the thinness of that line. Now he had walked it. Then he found Vandegrift, and the 2 men sat down together. And this is the thing the dispatches could never carry. Vandegrift did not send Nimitz a message this time. He sat across from him and told him, plainly, in his own steady voice, what the message traffic had been trying and failing to say for 6 weeks. He could hold the island. He believed it. but he could only hold it if the support he had been promised actually came, and came soon. More aircraft, more men, more of everything, before the Japanese massed enough strength to push him into the sea. Nimitz heard it from the man's own mouth. He watched his face while he said it. He could measure the difference between a general who was beaten and a general who was simply tired and still certain, and that was a difference no dispatch had ever been able to send him. The truth finally had a face, and a voice, and a look in the eye. And Nimitz did not stop with the general. He went out to the pilots of the ragged little air group flying off that cratered strip, men who took off between bomb craters in worn-out planes to meet Japanese formations that came nearly every day. He went to the men holding the line. He asked them questions, and then he did the harder thing. He listened to the answers. He built his own picture of the island from the ground up, from the men who lived on it, instead of from the message traffic coming down from the top. By the time he was done, Chester Nimitz knew Guadalcanal in a way that no stack of reports at Pearl Harbor could ever have taught him. Before he left, he pinned Navy crosses on men who had earned them, among them Evans Carlson, whose Marine raiders had carried the fight to the enemy in ways that had already become legend. Nimitz stood in front of Marines who had held a line the country back home was ready to write off, and by being there at all, he told them something no dispatch from Pearl Harbor ever could, that Washington had it wrong, that this island mattered, that they mattered. Word of who had come moved through the ranks the way word always moves, through men who have been forgotten, the commander of the whole Pacific Fleet, here, on their island, walking their ground, eating the same dust, standing in range of the same guns that came for them every night. For 6 weeks they had felt like the war had left them behind on an island no one back home cared about. And now the highest-ranking man in the ocean had come all that distance through contested sky to stand in front of them and tell them they mattered. The Marines had never seen a man wearing that many stars come this close to the front. Some of them had never seen the man who actually commanded them come at all, not once, in all the weeks they had been bleeding to hold the ground his orders told them to hold. If a single Japanese shell had found Henderson Field in the hours Nimitz stood on it, and shells found it most nights, the United States would have lost the man who ran the entire Pacific War, in one instant, on a strip of dirt most Americans could not have found on a map. He knew that. He walked the ridge anyway. Nimitz flew back the way he came, and he carried with him something he could not have gotten any other way. He now knew the island could be held. He had seen the line, talked to the man holding it, weighed the whole thing against what was actually there instead of against a stack of paper. That question, the biggest question in the Pacific, he had finally answered, and he had answered it with his own 2 eyes. But he had learned something else on that island too, and it was harder to carry. The men on Guadalcanal were doing everything that could be asked of human beings. The general leading them knew exactly what he needed and had said so, clearly, again and again. The failure was not down on that island at all. The Marines were not the problem, and neither was Vandegrift. The problem sat far to the south, aboard a ship that never moved into the fight, a command that had never once come to see the battle it was directing, and so had never learned to tell the island's real trouble from its own. He reached that conclusion without anger and without haste. The officer in question was an old friend, but Nimitz had done the one thing that friend had not. He had come. He had looked, and looking had told him what no message ever could, that the man running this fight from a cabin far to the south was no longer the man to run it at all. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz gathered his staff around him and put the question to them directly, the way he had learned to do the hardest things, out loud, in the open, with the people whose judgment he trusted. Should the man commanding the South Pacific be relieved? One by one, they said yes. It was not a small thing to do. You do not replace a theater commander in the middle of a battle that is still hanging by a thread. It sends a tremor through every headquarters in the fleet. It ends a career. And in this case, it ended the career of a man Nimitz had known and liked for years. The safe move, the move that protected everyone's reputation, including his own, was to leave things as they were and hope. Nimitz did not make the safe move. He sent the name of the man he wanted to Admiral King in Washington, William Halsey, a fighter, an aggressive carrier admiral the sailors and Marines already knew and already trusted. King approved it without hesitation. On the 18th of October, the change was made, and the effect on the island was almost past believing. One officer down in the South Pacific remembered the exact moment the news came down the line. 1 minute, he said, they were too sick with malaria to crawl out of their foxholes. The next, they were up and running around and shouting like children. Nothing about the enemy had changed. Not one Japanese ship had moved. Not one soldier. Not one gun. The men on Guadalcanal were just as hungry and just as sick as they had been the day before. What had changed was at the top, and the men in the mud felt it before the enemy ever did. I think that's the part people miss about command. The reports all crossed the same desk. The difference was never the information. The difference was that one man got on a plane to see it with his own eyes, and the other never left his cabin, and the whole Pacific turned on that. Within weeks the tide turned, and this time it stayed turned. In the middle of November, in a series of savage night actions in the water off the island, the same water the men had already named for the ships resting on the bottom of it, the Japanese lost their ability to feed reinforcements onto Guadalcanal faster than they lost them. The supply line into the island for the enemy was cut. By December, Van de Grift and the men of his division, the ones who had held that line through the shelling and the fever and the long weeks when no one back home was sure the island could be held at all, were finally pulled off Guadalcanal and sent to rest. Fresh troops took their place. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The island held, and the war in the Pacific, for the first time, began to move in one direction. There were 2 men in this story who commanded from the top. One of them ran the fight from a ship in a quiet harbor, from the message traffic and the reports, and never saw the island his orders were shaping. He was a decent officer, but the words on his desk lied to him, and he had no way to know it, because he never stood on the ground they described. The other one got on a plane, flew into a place where the shells fell most nights, and walked the mud where the line had almost broken. He came back knowing what the first man never learned. The difference between them was not nerve, and it was not skill. Both men had spent their lives in the Navy. Both had earned their stars the hard way. The difference was simpler than that, and it was harder than that. One of them went to sea for himself. The other stayed with the paper. Chester Nimitz would go on to command the entire Pacific War. He would direct fleets across the largest ocean on Earth through 3 more years of fighting, all the way to the deck of a battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay on the morning Japan signed the surrender. He made decisions that moved hundreds of thousands of men and decided the fate of nations. Few Americans in the whole war carried more weight on their shoulders, and few carried it as quietly. But the way he carried it, the habit that separated him from the men who led from a distance and never came to sea, was not learned in a headquarters. It was not learned from a manual. It was set on a cratered airstrip in the Solomon Islands, in a few hours in the mud, on an island that no one back home was sure could be held. On the day the most important admiral in the Pacific decided that the only way to know the truth was to go and stand in it himself. He put his own life on the line to learn something a piece of paper could not teach him. And what he learned there he carried for the rest of the war. If your father or your grandfather was on Guadalcanal in those months, in a foxhole at Henderson Field, on a ship out in the Sound, in the mud that even an admiral came down to walk, I want to hear about him. Whatever he told you, at the dinner table, on the porch, late at night, when he finally felt like talking, leave it in the comments. His name, his unit, whatever piece of his story you still carry. The history books recorded the admirals. They did not record him, but you heard it, and you don't have to let it disappear.
April 23rd, 1945. Guam. For nearly 3 months, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz has run the Pacific War from a hilltop on this island. A desk, a row of telephones, dispatches crossing it by the hundreds. Every day, from a fleet spread across more ocean than any single command has ever covered before. Down the hill from his quarters, the staff cars never stopped pulling in. Dispatch riders, couriers with the morning intelligence summaries. The war does not pause long enough for him to step outside it. He does not go to the front. He has officers for that. Spruance runs the fleet. Turner runs the landings. A war this size moves on cables, not on boot leather. Today, that changes. Today, Nimitz gets on a plane himself. He lands on an island that has not stopped burning since the 1st of April. Smoke still hangs over the southern hills. Out past the reef, the radar picket destroyers are standing their watch, the way they have stood it for 3 weeks straight, waiting on the next wave out of Kyushu. Nimitz has not come to inspect anything. He has come to see one man. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. commands the 10th Army, the force grinding its way south through a Japanese defense dug so deep into the island's coral spine that naval gunfire barely touches it. 3 weeks in, his infantry is gaining ground in yards. Some days, less. Every day, Buckner's line stays where it is. Nimitz's ships stay tied to the water off Okinawa, within range, within reach of pilots flying down from Kyushu with no plan to come home. He finds Buckner. No officers cleared from the room, no raised voice, just one admiral, looking at one general, saying the thing months of dispatches had failed to say. I'm losing a ship and a half a day. A pause. So, if this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone up here to move it, so we can get out from under these damn kamikaze attacks. 5 days. Then he is gone again. Back to the plane. Back to Guam. Back to the maps and the cables. No reporter is standing there to write it down. No camera catches it. The only reason anyone knows what was said is that the men standing nearby remembered it, because it was the kind of sentence a man doesn't forget hearing. A ship and a half a day is not a number. It is destroyers. It is the boys standing watch on them, 18, 19 years old, scanning a gray sky for a plane that means to kill them on purpose, and will not be talked out of it. Nimitz had spent 30 years learning how to read a casualty report without flinching. He had spent every one of those years learning which numbers he would not let stand. What does it take to make a man leave a war room he has run for more than 3 years and stand in front of someone else's army, just to say one sentence? That question has an answer. It starts 3 weeks earlier, on a beach that should not have been this easy to take. Somewhere in that fleet. There was a young man who never told you the whole story. If this might be a piece of his story too, hit like for him. He earned that a long time ago. April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, on the same morning, on the other side of the world, from anyone keeping track of the irony. The men climbing down into landing craft off Okinawa are not thinking about either one. Iwo Jima had been declared secure less than a week earlier. Before that, Peleliu. Before that, Tarawa. Every one of those beaches taught the same lesson, paid for in the same coin. The Japanese do not fight for the sand. They let the beach go and make you pay for every yard after it. So the Marines and soldiers hitting the shore at Higuchi brace for the worst morning of their lives. It doesn't come. They wade in standing upright. No mortars walking the beach, no machine guns out of the tree line. Men who crawled the last 3 landings on their stomachs walk this one like a drill back in California. By nightfall, 60,000 men are ashore. 2 airfields already belong to the United States. Some of the men spend that first evening walking the high ground around Yontan and Kadena, looking for a fight that never shows up. A few try the local fruit growing wild along the terraced hillsides. Somebody finds a goat and argues about keeping it. After 3 landings that opened with the worst few minutes of their lives, an entire division stands around on a Pacific island with nothing to shoot at. A week into the landing, with resistance still nowhere to be found. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner cannot quite believe what he is looking at. He sends word back to Nimitz at the advance headquarters on Guam. "I may be crazy," he writes, "but it looks like the Japanese have quit the war, at least in this sector." Nimitz reads it. He does not share the optimism. "Delete all after crazy," he sends back. He is not being unkind. He has done this since December of 1941. He has watched easy landings turn into 3-month grinds before more than once, and he knows the Japanese have not gone anywhere. They have simply chosen, this time, to let the beach go. He is proven right within 5 days. The fight that mattered most in the campaign's first weeks had nothing to do with the beach at all. It had already happened, before a single Marine waded ashore. Weeks earlier, while carrier pilots were still working over the airfields of Kyushu, Nimitz had gone after something he had no authority to take. He wanted Army Air Force bombers, the same B-29s burning Japanese cities by night, turned against the airfields where Japan's kamikaze squadrons were forming up. Major General Curtis LeMay did not want to give them to him. LeMay ran the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industry, and as far as he was concerned, parking his bombers over a string of airstrips to protect somebody else's ships was somebody else's war. Nimitz was not in LeMay's chain of command. He had no order he could give that LeMay was bound to follow. CINCPAC and the 20th Air Force answered to different masters, and LeMay's masters wanted Tokyo in ashes, not a string of airfields on Kyushu. Nimitz made his case through channels that were not built for this kind of argument, and he kept making it until it held. On March 29th, and again on March 31st, B-29s that were supposed to be over Tokyo dropped their bombs on Kyushu instead. It did not stop what was coming. Nothing was going to stop what was coming. On April 6th, it came. 400 Japanese aircraft launched out of Kyushu that afternoon, more than half of them flown by pilots with no intention of landing again. The Japanese called it kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. It was not a raid. It was the opening of something the United States Navy had never faced before, and would never face again at this scale. An enemy air arm built entirely around the certainty of its own destruction. The American answer to it had already been built before the first plane ever took off. A ring of destroyers pushed out to the edges of the formation, carrying radar and little else to recommend the assignment. Early warning, first contact, first target. The men standing that watch had a name for it within the first week. They called it the Bull's Eye. Behind them, Marine corsairs held close to the ships themselves, the last line before a kamikaze ever got within gun range. Further out, Navy fighters off the carriers reached 50 miles ahead of the fleet to meet the incoming raids before they ever crossed into sight of a single ship. Combat air patrols stacked overhead from dawn to dusk, landing, refueling, rearming, launching again, on flight decks that never stopped moving. It was not a perfect system. Nothing built that fast against a threat that new ever is. But on April 6, 1945, for the first time, the United States Navy stood and met an enemy that had given up on surviving the war, with men who had not, No one ordered that fleet to hold its ground under that kind of weather. It simply never went anywhere. That spring, the men fighting ashore gave the Fifth Fleet a nickname of its own. They called it the fleet that came to stay. It was not a compliment handed out for nothing. On picket ships up and down the line, gun crews kept loading after the barrels ran hot enough to blister a bare hand through a glove. Captains held their stations with holes already torn through the hull, because the destroyers behind them still needed the warning those radar screens were giving. On April 6th, the first day of the mass attacks, kamikazes found 2 ammunition ships, Logan Victory and Hobbs Victory, and sent both to the bottom. The shells they were carrying were the same shells Buckner's artillery needed to break the Japanese line ashore. The convoys behind them did not stop coming. They could not. The infantry on the beach needed what was in those holds more than the Navy needed to keep its ships out of range. Nobody ordered any of that. There was no regulation requiring a damaged ship to keep firing instead of falling out of formation and heading for repairs. No order compelling the next convoy to sail into water that had just swallowed the last one. The fleet did it because the alternative was leaving the men on the beach with nothing standing between them and the next wave out of Kyushu. At Guam, the reports reached Nimitz every day. Not the casualty lists first. Those came later, in the official tallies. What came first were the operational summaries. Ships hit, ships sunk, ships still on station despite both. Spruance and Turner had been pressing Buckner for weeks to move the ground line faster, to shorten the time the fleet spent tied to a beachhead under fire from the sky. The pressing had not worked. By the 4th week of April, Nimitz had read enough of those summaries to get on a plane himself. What happened next has already been told. 18 days after he stood in front of Buckner and said his piece, the fleet was still doing exactly what it had been doing since the 6th of April. On May 11th, it did it better than anyone thought a single ship could. That morning, at Radar Picket Station 15, northwest of Okinawa, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley took her station alongside her sister ship Evans and 4 smaller support craft. At 7:45, a single Japanese float plane came in low over the water, low enough to slip past the radar. Hadley's lookouts caught it by eye, and her gunners shot it down, close aboard, before it ever reached the formation. For a few minutes, the morning went quiet again. Then radar picked up a formation that would grow to roughly 150 Japanese aircraft, the 6th mass kamikaze raid of the campaign. Marine Corsairs flying combat air patrol overhead met them first, shooting down so many that some pilots ran out of ammunition and started forcing kamikazes into the water by flying alongside them and riding them down, wingtip to wingtip, until the Japanese pilots lost control rather than reach the ships at all. It was not enough to stop all of them. For nearly 2 hours, Hadley's gun crews never stopped firing. Her captain, Commander Mullaney, held the ship in the fight the entire time. Evans fought the same fight beside her until kamikaze hits left her dead in the water a little before 9 o'clock. Hadley kept going alone. At 9:20, 10 planes came at her at once, from the bow and the stern in the same breath. Her gunners tracked them, fired, and brought down all 10 before a single one reached the hull. Her luck ran out minutes later. A bomb. A piloted rocket bomb the Japanese called Oka. 2 more kamikazes in quick succession. By the time the attack finally broke off, Hadley had downed 23 aircraft in an hour and 40 minutes, a record no other ship in the United States Navy would match in a single engagement, before or since. Her gunners had fired more than 15,000 rounds to do it. She did not sink. Below decks, damage control parties worked through flooded compartments to keep her afloat, while the gunners above them kept firing. She made it to Aishima under her own power. Then to Karama Reto, for repairs that could only hold her together. then on a tow line, all the way back to San Francisco. Her crew brought her home. The Navy gave her a Presidential Unit citation. The men who served on her gave her a name that stuck longer than any citation ever could: the Champion Kamikaze Killer. Nobody aboard was thinking about a fleet nickname when the shooting started. They were thinking about the next plane, and the one after it, and the one after that. The nickname was something other people gave them afterward, for not doing the one thing that would have been easiest: cutting the engines, signaling for help, waiting to be saved. They never signaled for that. In the same week, the kamikaze attacks began. The Imperial Japanese Navy made one last throw with the largest battleship it had ever built. On the evening of April 6th, the battleship Yamato left the anchorage at Tokuyama. Beside her sailed the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. Nobody aboard carried enough fuel for a return voyage. The orders were simple, and they were final. Fight through to Okinawa. Run the ship aground on the beach if she made it that far. Use her 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on any warship, as a fixed battery for as long as she could still fire them. And let her crew finish the war as infantry once the guns went silent. There was no air cover assigned to her. Japan had almost nothing left to fly. 2 American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback, picked her up coming out of the Bungo Strait that same evening and radioed her course back to the fleet. By morning, Admiral Mark Mitcher had everything he needed to know exactly where to look. He launched 386 aircraft off 15 carriers. Fighters first, to silence her anti-aircraft guns. Dive bombers next, to wreck her radar and her fire control. Torpedo planes last, skimming the wave tops at 200 feet, aiming for the one place 18 inches of steel could not protect her: the hull, below the waterline, on a single side, over and over, until the ship could no longer counter-flood fast enough to stay upright. The first wave found her at 12:32 in the afternoon on April 7th. For close to 2 hours, Yamato's gunners answered everything that came at them. It made no difference. Nothing in her arsenal had been built to answer an attack that arrived from the sky in these numbers, because no navy on Earth had ever needed to design one before. By 2:05, with her list past the point, any gun could still be trained against gravity. The order came to abandon ship. Many of the men below decks never received it. At 2:20, she rolled over. 3 minutes later, her forward magazines went up. 500 tons of ammunition, in one explosion. A fireball that climbed 6 kilometers into the sky. Of her crew of 3,332, 269 survived. The Yahagi and 4 of her 8 escorting destroyers went down with her. American losses that day: 10 aircraft. The largest battleship ever put to sea had been built around an idea more than 60 years old: that the nation with the biggest guns, mounted on the thickest steel, wins the next war at sea. Japan had poured more of its national treasure into Yamato than into any warship in its history, betting everything that the idea would hold one more time. It did not hold for one afternoon. Carrier aircraft sank her before her main guns ever fired a single round at an American ship. There is one more detail about that ship worth knowing, and it has nothing to do with steel or guns. Yamato was not just a name picked for a battleship. It is the old, poetic word for Japan itself, the name the country called itself before it had any other. The Imperial Navy had built its flagship out of the nation's own ancient name. In April of 1945, in under 2 hours, off a coast nobody back home could find on a map, American carrier pilots sank it. Chester Nimitz had bet against that whole way of thinking 3 decades earlier. Back when he was a young officer arguing for submarines, nobody in Washington particularly wanted to fund. The argument had never really been about submarines, or carriers, or any one weapon. It was about which navy understood first that the age of the battleship had an ending, and built itself ready for the day it came. Before that sentence ever reached Buckner, Spruance and Turner had already tried saying something close to it. Not in person. By cable. The way two admirals normally talk to an army general they do not command and have no authority to order around. Spruance was holding the fleet together under kamikaze attacks that never seemed to let up. Turner was still running supply convoys into the same waters, into the same risk. Every day, the ground campaign stayed in place. Both men watched the advance stall in front of the Japanese defenses at Shuri, week after week, and both sent word up the chain that the pace had to change. The cables went out. The pace did not change much. On April 20th, after weeks of grinding losses, Buckner's troops finally broke through the first major Japanese defensive line, the one running through Makinato. It had cost them dearly to get there, and what waited past it was a second line, then a third, each one dug as deep as the last. The Army had a breakthrough to show for 3 weeks of fighting. The Navy still had a fleet sitting in range of Kyushu, paying for every one of those weeks in ships. Buckner was not being stubborn for its own sake. His divisions were fighting through a defense the Japanese had spent months digging into solid rock, and he had already tried to break it open all at once, on April 19th, with everything he had: artillery, naval gunfire, hundreds of aircraft, the heaviest barrage of the campaign so far. The Japanese simply went deeper underground and waited it out. Buckner believed the only way through Shuri was straight through it, at whatever pace that took and whatever it cost. There was another way to attack the problem, and it was Nimitz's own fleet admirals who wanted it badly. The 10th Army had the landing craft, and a veteran Marine division. It could still commit to put a fresh force ashore behind the Japanese line entirely, at a beach near Minatoga on the southeastern coast, and force Ushijima's army to fight in 2 directions at once. Spruance wanted it. Turner wanted it. The Marine generals pressed it hard enough that the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Alexander Vandegrift, flew out personally to make the case to Buckner's face. One of Buckner's own division commanders, fresh off pulling the same maneuver successfully behind Japanese lines at Leyte only months earlier, had been pushing for it since before his men finished the fight for Ishima. Buckner said no. It was not stubbornness. His staff warned him the beaches at Minatoga could not support the supply tonnage a second front would need. His intelligence officers reported Japanese reserves still dug in along exactly that stretch of coast, ready to meet any landing there. And Buckner had read enough about the Allied landing at Anzio the year before to know what could happen to a division put ashore behind enemy lines with nowhere to go, but the beach it landed on. What happened next surprised almost everyone watching. Nimitz came down on the same side as Buckner, overruling his own fleet admirals and the Marine generals he had commanded since Guadalcanal to do it. The 2 questions appear to have been settled around the same visit, days apart at most. Nimitz did not treat decisiveness as one setting he kept turned up at all times. On the question of whether to risk a second landing, Buckner's judgment was the one he trusted. On the question of how much longer the fleet could keep absorbing a ship and a half a day, he trusted his own. That second question is the one that had put him on the plane in the first place, not a new argument. The same one Spruance and Turner had already made by cable, delivered now by the one man in the entire Pacific theater, whose chain of command Buckner could not simply read past and set aside, said to his face, with a deadline attached. Buckner heard him out. He did not relieve a single officer on the spot. He did not change his strategy that afternoon, and he did not promise anything beyond what he had already been doing. He went back to grinding forward at Shuri, the same way he had been grinding forward since the 19th. 4 days later, on April 27th, He signed the orders. The 1st Marine Division moved south to relieve the battered 27th Infantry Division on the line. The 77th Infantry Division relieved the 96th. Not long after, the 6th Marine Division followed them south, bringing the entire 3rd Amphibious Corps onto the southern front for the first time since the landing. Nobody can draw a straight line from one admiral's sentence to one general's order 4 days later. Buckner had his own reasons, his own timetable, his own sense of when his reserves were finally ready to move, and he never said otherwise in any account he left behind. What can be said is this: the man running the entire United States Pacific Fleet did not send a strongly worded cable and wait for a reply, the way Spruance and Turner had for weeks running. He left the headquarters he had occupied for nearly 3 months. He flew to a battlefield that was not his to command, found a general from a different service entirely, and said one thing, once, to his face. With fresh divisions now on the southern line, the reinforced position held against a major Japanese counteroffensive on May 4th. Ushijima's gunners moved their artillery out into the open to support it, firing 13,000 rounds in a single push, and lost dozens of guns to American counter-battery fire for the trouble. The attack failed. Buckner launched his own renewed offensive on May 11th. By the 14th, the Marines were grinding into a fortified rise the Japanese called Sugarloaf Hill, taking it apart over the next 2 weeks with naval gunfire, field artillery, rockets, and napalm. It would take 6 more weeks of fighting like that to finish what the offensive started. Nobody on either side called it fast, but it moved, in a way the previous 3 weeks had not, and the fleet kept its station offshore the entire time, still paying the price Nimitz had flown out to talk about, still not going anywhere. That is not the kind of authority that comes from rank. It is the kind that comes from showing up. By the end of May 1945, Spruance had not come off that flag bridge in months, Iwo Jima in February, then straight through the planning, the landing, and every week of kamikaze attacks at Okinawa since. His fleet carried a different name, depending on who held the flag. 5th Fleet under him, 3rd under Halsey. But the ships and the men fighting them never stopped long enough to notice the difference. Whichever name was painted on the orders that week, the staff behind it had been awake the whole time. Nimitz watched that toll add up the same way he watched everything, without comment, without panic, without looking away from it. This was not the first time he had pulled an exhausted commander out of a fight. Nearly 3 years earlier, at Guadalcanal, he had quietly relieved a man who could no longer carry the weight of that campaign. A decision made because the officer himself was starting to come apart under it. Set side by side, the 2 decisions can look like an echo of each other. They were not the same decision. Nobody questioned whether the 5th Fleet had done its job in the spring of 1945. Nobody questioned Spruance's judgment, then or since. He had not started missing things. He had not lost the confidence of the men around him. What Nimitz was looking at on May 27th was not a man failing. It was a man who had not failed at all, doing the math on how much longer that could hold, and deciding not to find out the hard way. He relieved Spruance and his entire staff in the middle of the campaign. Weeks before the fighting on Okinawa was finished, William Halsey took the fleet. Overnight. The same ships answered to a different name again, without missing a single watch. The relief did not reach the sailors standing watch on the ships themselves. They stayed exactly where they were, under whichever name the fleet carried that week, because the war did not pause for them the way it could, briefly, for the men planning it from a desk. There is a version of decisiveness that only ever looks forward. More pressure, more speed, more demands on the men ahead of you. Nimitz had that version. He had used it a month earlier, standing in front of Buckner. Okinawa is also where he showed the other version, the one where the hardest call is not pushing harder. It is pulling your best people back before they have given you any reason to, because you can see further down the road than they can from where they are standing. Okinawa fell on June 22nd, 82 days after the landing, roughly on the timeline the Navy needed it to fall. The line at Shuri did not break from one decision or one sentence. It broke because divisions kept moving onto it, because carriers kept launching off Mitcher's decks, because picket ships kept standing their watch, until there was nowhere left for that line to hold. Yamato sits on the bottom of the East China Sea, the way she has since the afternoon of April 7th. The fleet that earned its nickname that spring never once pulled back from the water off that island. Not for a single day. Until the island was finally secured, a ship and a half a day was never a statistic to the man who said it. It was a radar picket line standing watch every morning before dawn, not knowing whether today was the day. It was a gun crew that lost count of how many planes they had shot down, somewhere past the 20th. It was a young man, maybe 19, maybe 20, who never came home to tell anyone what that morning sounded like, and a young man right beside him who did come home, and never quite found the words either. Most of those men are gone now. The ones who are left are in their late 90s, if they are anywhere at all. What they carried out of that water off Okinawa, most of them carried quietly, for the rest of their lives, without ever once describing it the way it actually happened. Some mornings a man simply decides are not for telling, and keeps that decision for 60 or 70 years. That is usually where these stories end, in silence, in a kitchen somewhere, never spoken out loud by the only people who were actually there. If somebody in your family stood watch on a ship in the Pacific, a destroyer, a carrier, a submarine, anything that floated and fought, tell us which one, if you still know its name. Tell us his job aboard it, too. If you remember it, loader, lookout, engine room. Whatever he did down there kept that ship in the fight one more day than it might have lasted without him. Put it in the comments. Let the name of his ship outlive the war it fought in.
Pearl Harbor. The battleships are still burning. The fleet that was supposed to protect America is sunk in the mud of its own harbor. And in Washington, men are already saying the Pacific is lost before the fight has even begun. 10 days later, Franklin Roosevelt makes a choice that stuns his own Navy. He hands what's left of that Pacific, every ship still floating, to a man who runs a desk. An admiral, 28 names down the list. The one man everyone else had passed over. And here's what makes no sense. This man had already turned the job down once, 11 months earlier, because he thought he wasn't ready. The admiral who took it instead is the one whose career just died at Pearl Harbor. So why him? Why now? Why the one officer nobody expected? The answer isn't what the newspapers printed. It isn't what the Navy expected. It comes down to one quiet decision, made in a single room. A decision that would change the ocean where your fathers and grandfathers fought. Stay with me, and I'll take you into that room. And if you honor the men who held the line in those first dark months, take a second and tap that like button. It tells YouTube these stories still matter. Now, let me take you into that room. It is the middle of December, 1941. The rain has been falling on Washington for days. Inside the Navy Department, the mood is not grief. Grief would be simpler. The mood is something closer to shame. The quiet, sick feeling of men who have just watched the unthinkable happen and cannot yet believe they let it. The Pacific Fleet is gone. Not all of it, but enough. The battleships that were the pride of the United States Navy are sitting on the bottom of a harbor in Hawaii, and more than 2,000 American sailors are dead. The men in that building have spent their whole lives preparing for a war at sea, and in one Sunday morning, the enemy came and took the fleet apart while it slept. And the bad news has not stopped coming. Even as they count the dead at Pearl Harbor, word arrives from the far side of the ocean that the enemy is on the move everywhere at once, sweeping down through the islands, taking in days what it had taken America a generation to build. There is a feeling in that building that the bottom has not yet been found, that things can still get worse. And they are right. And it is not only the Navy that is afraid. Out along the whole western coast of the country, ordinary Americans are lying awake. In the cities by the Pacific, the lights are going dark at night now, windows covered, street lamps out, because no one knows where the enemy will strike next. And after Pearl Harbor, no one is willing to say it could not happen here. Mothers are watching the sky over California. The ocean that had always felt like a wall protecting America has become, overnight, the road an enemy might come down. That is the fear the man in Washington has to answer. Not just a lost fleet, a frightened nation. Someone has to be sent to fix it. And that is the question that hangs over every office in the building. There is a list. There is always a list. The senior flag officers of the United States Navy, ranked in order, men with decades of service, men who had commanded fleets and squadrons, men whose names carried weight in every wardroom in the country. When you need a commander for the most important post in the Navy, you start at the top of that list and you work your way down. Roosevelt did not start at the top. He did not stop at the second name, or the fifth, or the 10th. He passed over 28 of them, every one senior to the man he finally chose. The man he chose was not a fighting admiral with a famous name. He was the head of the Bureau of Navigation, which, despite the name, had almost nothing to do with navigation. It was the office that handled people, assignments, promotions, careers. It was the desk where the Navy decided who went up and who stayed where they were. That was the man Roosevelt wanted, a rear admiral, a personnel officer, a man most of the country had never heard of. His name was Chester Nimitz. Now, there is something you should understand about why Roosevelt's eye fell on him. Because it was not an accident, and it was not luck. In the years before the war, running that personnel desk, Nimitz had come into the president's orbit again and again. He advised on who should command what, and Roosevelt had learned something about him in those meetings that mattered more than seniority, more than fame, more than a warrior's reputation. He had learned that Chester Nimitz told him the truth, not the comfortable version, not the version a man wants to hear when he is president and the news is bad. The true version. When Nimitz thought Roosevelt was wrong. Nimitz said so, plainly and without theater, and then went back to his work. In a city full of men who told the president what they believed he wanted, here was one who told him what he needed. Roosevelt did not forget it. And when the worst day came, and he needed a man he could trust with the ocean, he did not reach for the biggest name, he reached for the honest one. The order came down plain. Roosevelt did not dress it up. He told Nimitz to get out to Pearl Harbor and not to come back until the war was won. Think about what that sentence really was. It was not a congratulation. It was not a reward. It was a sentence handed to a man at the worst moment in the history of his service, and it came with no promise that the man would ever come home. And the officers around him could not understand it. They knew Nimitz. Some of them outranked him. Some of them had watched him climb, steady and unhurried, through 36 years of service without ever once demanding the spotlight. He was competent. Everyone agreed he was competent. But competent was not what they thought this moment called for. This moment called for a warrior. A name. A man the enemy would fear. And Roosevelt looked past all of them and reached down the list and put his hand on the shoulder of the man who ran the personnel office. Why? That is the question this whole story turns on. And to answer it fully, you have to understand who this quiet man really was and how far he had come to be standing in that room at all. He had not started out as anyone's obvious choice for greatness. Far from it. More than 30 years earlier, when he was still a young ensign, Chester Nimitz was given his first command, an old, tired destroyer, and he ran it aground, put it right up on a sandbar. They court-martialed him for it, found him guilty of hazarding a ship of the United States Navy. It could have ended his career before it began. Many careers ended for less, but the senior admiral who reviewed the case wrote a single line on the report that tells you everything about how the Navy sometimes gets it right. He wrote that this was a good officer and that he would take more care in the future. They gave the young man a second chance, and the young man never forgot what a second chance was worth. Remember that. It will matter before this story is done. He was a submarine man in the early days, when submarines were new and dangerous and unglamorous. He lost part of a finger to a diesel engine while showing it off to visitors. He once jumped overboard into freezing water to save a drowning sailor and earned a medal for it, and wrote to the woman he would marry that all he had done was go swimming and that it had been awfully, awfully cold. That was the man, brave without noise, steady without show. The kind of man who does the hard thing and then makes a small joke about the cold. And there is one more thing you have to know, the strangest thing of all, about how he came to that room. Because the truth is, this was not the first time they had offered him the Pacific. Months before all this, before Pearl Harbor, before the world came apart, the command of the Pacific Fleet had been placed in front of Chester Nimitz, the most powerful sea command the United States had to give. And he turned it down. He turned it down. Not because he doubted the fleet, because he doubted himself. He looked at the men above him on that same list, the men with more years, more stars, more claim to the chair, and he decided that taking the job over their heads would breed resentment he did not want and did not deserve. He thought he was too junior. He said so, and he stepped aside. So the job went to another man, a capable, respected officer named Husband Kimmel. Kimmel took the command that Nimitz had declined. Kimmel moved his flag to Hawaii. Kimmel was sitting in that chair on the morning of December 7th, and when the bombs fell and the fleet burned, it was Kimmel's name that went into the headlines. Kimmel's career that was broken in an afternoon. Kimmel, who carried the blame for a disaster no single man could have stopped. The chair Nimitz refused became the chair that destroyed the man who took it. And now that same chair was being offered to Nimitz again, only this time it was not a peacetime honor. This time, it was a burning harbor and a shattered fleet, and a nation that had just been told it was losing. This time, he did not decline. I've read a lot about that choice over the years, and what stays with me isn't the strategy. It's this. Roosevelt bet the whole ocean on a man who had already looked him in the eye and said he wasn't sure he was ready. But here is what makes the choice stranger still. It was not only the 28 admirals who doubted it. The doubt reached higher than that. Some of the most powerful men in the Navy, the men Nimitz would now have to answer to, were not convinced Roosevelt had chosen right. They knew him as a mild man, a courteous man, a man who did not raise his voice or pound the table, and they wondered, privately, whether a mild man was what you sent to fight the most dangerous navy on Earth. So when Chester Nimitz packed his bags and turned his face toward Hawaii, he was not carrying the confidence of his service. He was carrying its doubts, all of them. He was flying west to take command of a fleet that had been beaten, surrounded by officers who had been beaten with it, under the eyes of superiors who half expected him to fail. That was the job. That was the whole job. And the first thing he had to do was see, with his own eyes, exactly how bad it was. He arrived on Christmas morning. There was no ceremony waiting for him. There was rain, a steady, gray, soaking rain coming down out of low clouds over the Hawaiian coast. The flying boat carrying the new commander came down through the weather and touched the water, and as it slowed, Chester Nimitz looked out through the haze at the harbor he had come to save. He saw them then, the battleships, not sailing, not floating, lying there, half under the water, tilted at angles no ship is ever meant to sit at. The hulls and the sides and the crazy jutting tops of them showing above the surface beside Ford Island. The most powerful vessels in the United States Navy resting in the mud where the enemy had left them. He was wearing civilian clothes, no uniform, no flags, just a man in an ordinary suit, looking out a small window at the wreckage of everything he had spent his life serving. And the timing of his arrival made it worse. For days, a garrison of Marines on a tiny, faraway island had been holding out against everything the enemy could throw at them. A last, defiant spark of good news in a season of disasters. A relief force had been sent to save them, and then, with the rescuers still hundreds of miles short, that relief had been called back, judged too risky, and the island had been left to its fate. It had fallen just 2 days before Nimitz came down out of the clouds. So the new commander arrived not on a rising note, but a falling one, into the fresh, raw grief of one more defeat, one more place lost, one more set of American names added to the list. A launch came alongside. He stepped down into it and shook hands with the officers who had come to meet him, men who worked for the commander who had just been relieved. Men who did not yet know what this new admiral would do to them. And together they moved out across that harbor, past the wrecks, through the oil still floating on the water, to the shore. There is a thing that happens to men after a defeat like that. It is not fear, exactly. It is heavier than fear. It is the sense that you have failed at the one thing you were trusted to do, and that everyone will know it for the rest of your life. The officers who greeted Nimitz were carrying that weight. Every one of them. They had been at Pearl Harbor when it happened. Some of them believed, in their hearts, that they should have seen it coming. They were not looking to the new commander for orders. They were bracing for judgment. They expected to be swept aside, sent off to some forgotten desk to sit out the war in disgrace. Nimitz saw all of it, and he said very little. For 6 days he watched, and listened, and took the measure of what he had inherited. And then, on the last day of that terrible year, he took command. It should have been done on the deck of a battleship. That is the tradition. A great gray warship, flags snapping, the fleet drawn up in the harbor. But there was no battleship to stand on. There was no undamaged deck grand enough for the occasion, because the enemy had seen to that. So they held it on a submarine. Chester Nimitz stood on the narrow deck of the submarine Grayling, tied up at the pier, and read his orders aloud from there. Part of it was fitting. He had begun his career in submarines decades before, and there was something right about a submariner taking command from a submarine's deck. But part of it was simply the truth of the moment. There was nowhere else to stand. On that day he became a full admiral. He rose past the rank in between as if it were not there, straight to 4 stars, because the moment did not allow for the ordinary pace of things. And then he spoke, not for long. He gathered the senior officers around him, some of them men who had once outranked him, men whose careers now lay in his hands, and he did not lecture them, and he did not condemn them. He told them the plain truth, that they had taken a tremendous blow. And then he told them the other truth, the one no one in that harbor had dared to say out loud in 3 weeks. That he had no doubt, none, about how this would end. "We have taken a tremendous wallop," he said, "but I have no doubt of the ultimate outcome." Understand who was listening. Men who had watched the fleet die. Men who thought the war was already half lost. And here was this quiet Texan, standing on the deck of a submarine, because there was nothing else left to stand on, telling them he was certain of victory, not hoping, certain. That was the first thing he gave them. Before a single ship was raised, before a single plan was drawn, he gave them the one thing they had lost. He gave them a commander who believed. And here is the thing about that belief. It was not a bluff. He had looked hard at what remained, with the cold eye of a man who had spent his life sizing up ships and men, and he had seen what the frightened could not. Yes, the battleships were down. But the great aircraft carriers, the ships that would actually decide this war, though few yet understood it, had not been in the harbor when the bombs fell. They were still out there, still whole. The enemy had sunk the past and left the future floating. And there was more. The vast tanks of fuel oil that powered the whole Pacific Fleet, millions of barrels of it, the lifeblood of every operation to come, sat untouched. The repair yards, the docks, the workshops that could raise the sunken and mend the broken, untouched. The enemy had struck a terrible blow, but in his hurry to hammer the battleships, he had left standing the very things that would let America come back. Nimitz saw it. Where others saw only ruin, he did the harder thing. He counted what was left. And what was left was enough. There was one hard truth in that ledger, and he made his peace with it too. Unlike the enemy admiral across the ocean, who would ride to war on the deck of the greatest battleship ever built, Nimitz would fight this war from a desk on shore. No flagship, no bridge beneath his feet, just a modest house above the harbor and the weight of every decision. He accepted it without complaint, the way he accepted most things, and went to work. And what he did next, no one expected. Everyone assumed there would be a reckoning. That is how these things go. A new commander arrives after a disaster, and he cleans house. He brings in his own men. He sweeps out the staff of the man who failed, because their failure clings to them, and because the public wants to see that someone has paid. The staff at Pearl Harbor knew this. The officers who had served under the relieved commander, the intelligence men, the war planners, the specialists who had been at their posts when the attack came, they were certain their time was over. They had seen their old chief taken down in front of the whole country. They expected to follow him into the dark. Most of them hoped, at best, to be sent to sea, where they might at least die usefully instead of rotting behind a desk under a cloud they could never lift. Nimitz called them together, and he told them he wanted them to stay. He said it simply. Any man who wanted a transfer would have his help getting one, no questions, no shame. But he hoped they would remain. He needed them. He trusted them. The knowledge in their heads, the hard, bitter, expensive knowledge of this enemy and this ocean, was worth more to him than any clean slate. For men who had walked in expecting to be fired, it was like water in a desert. Now think back. Think back to a young ensign, decades before, who ran his first ship aground and should have lost everything, and was given a second chance instead by an older man who saw the officer he might become. Nimitz had lived that. He knew, from the inside, exactly what it did to a man to be written off, and exactly what it did to a man to be trusted anyway. And now, standing over a room full of officers the whole country wanted to blame, he made the same choice that had once been made for him. The easy thing, the popular thing, was to blame them. The whole country was looking for someone to blame, and here was a room full of convenient targets, already broken, already ashamed. Nimitz could have thrown every one of them overboard and no one would have said a word against him. He kept them instead. He looked at men the rest of the world had already condemned, and he saw not the failure behind them, but the fight still ahead. And he decided he would rather go into that fight with men who knew the enemy than with strangers who did not. That was not softness. Anyone who mistook it for softness would learn better in time. It was judgment, cold, clear judgment about what actually wins a war. And what actually wins a war is not punishment. It is people, good people, kept and trusted and pointed in the right direction. And he did not stop at keeping them. He built something around them. Day after day, he brought his officers together, not to hand down orders from on high, but to talk, to argue, to lay the hardest problems of the war on the table and let the sharpest minds in the room pull them apart. A young officer could look the commander in the eye and tell him he was wrong, and the commander would listen. Day after day, that room became the thing a beaten staff needs most and gets least, a place where their judgment mattered again. Men who had come to Hawaii expecting to be discarded found themselves, instead, being asked what they thought. And slowly, in the ordinary work of those daily meetings, the shame began to lift, and the fight began to return. He did not give them a speech and walk away. He rebuilt them, one honest conversation at a time. But keeping the staff was only part of the problem in front of him. Because Chester Nimitz did not have one set of doubters to win over, he had two. The first were the men beneath him and around him, the shattered fleet, the guilty staff, the officers who needed to believe again. Those he was already reaching. The second was the man above him. Nimitz did not command the war alone. Above him stood one of the hardest men ever to wear the uniform, the officer who ran the entire Navy's fighting operations, a man as sharp and unforgiving as Nimitz was gentle. And that man was not sure Roosevelt had chosen right. He looked at Nimitz's mild manner and his easy courtesy, and he wondered whether this Texan had the iron for it, whether, when the moment came, Nimitz would be willing to take the terrible risks that winning would demand. The doubt was not idle. It shaped the war. Early on, rather than trust the whole Pacific to Nimitz's hand, his superior carved off a piece of it and kept that piece under his own direct control, pulling ships and authority away from the very commander he had just helped appoint. It was a quiet vote of no confidence, written in the language of organization charts, and Nimitz understood exactly what it meant. He did not fight it with anger. That was not his way. He answered it the only way that ever truly changes a hard man's mind, with results, and with patience. Beginning in the spring, the two of them met again and again, face to face, talking through the war, the plans, the men, the risks. 16 times across the years to come, they would sit down together like that. And slowly, meeting by meeting, the doubt in the harder man began to give way. He came to see that beneath the mild surface was exactly the aggression the moment needed. That the courteous Texan was, in fact, hungry to attack. Because Nimitz did not intend to sit behind his shattered harbor and wait, while the wrecks were still being pumped out, while the fleet was still counting what it had left, he was already sending his carriers out to hit back. It was reckless, some thought, throwing his most precious ships, the few undamaged carriers he still owned, straight into harm's way against an enemy riding the highest tide of victory in his history. But Nimitz understood something the timid did not. A fleet that only defends has already half surrendered. He would not let his men believe they were beaten, so he sent them out to draw blood, to raid, to strike, to remind the enemy, and themselves, that the United States Navy was still in this fight. That was the quiet man Roosevelt had chosen. Not a shouter, not a showman. A man who believed when no one else did, who kept the people others would have thrown away, who won over the hardest doubter in the service, and who, with his fleet still lying broken in the mud, was already reaching for the enemy's throat. And now the only question left was whether Roosevelt's strange, stubborn, against-the-grain choice would actually work. The answer began to come in the spring. In May, out in the Coral Sea, the enemy pushed south, reaching toward the sea lanes that connected America to Australia, reaching to cut the lifeline before the war had truly begun. And for the first time in the history of warfare, two fleets fought a battle in which the ships never saw each other at all. It was decided entirely in the air. Carrier against carrier, planes crossing miles of open ocean to find an enemy over the horizon. When the smoke cleared, the accountants could call it close to even. But the accountants missed the point. The enemy's advance toward Australia had been stopped. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the tide had reached its mark and been turned back. It was not a triumph, but it was proof. The first hard proof that this enemy could be checked, that the ocean was not lost after all. And then came June. The enemy gathered his strength for a single, crushing blow. A trap laid at a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, meant to lure out what remained of the American fleet and finish the work begun at Pearl Harbor. It was a good plan. It should have worked. The enemy had more ships, more planes, more experience, and every reason in the world to expect victory. But Nimitz had kept his staff, and among the men he had refused to throw away was an intelligence officer, one of those specialists who had walked in expecting to be fired, and who had been told instead to stay. That officer and his team had been listening to the enemy's coded traffic, piecing it together, and they told Nimitz where the blow would fall, and roughly when. Here was the whole gamble come round in a circle. The decision Nimitz had made in his first hours, to keep the men everyone else would have discarded, was now the one thing standing between America and another catastrophe. If he had cleaned house like every instinct of the moment demanded, the men who could read the enemy's mail would have been scattered to the wind. He had kept them, and now they handed him the enemy's plan. Nimitz believed them. He staked everything on it. He sent his carriers to wait in ambush for a fleet that did not know it had been read. When it was over, the officer who had made the prediction was teased that he had been slightly off, a few miles, a few degrees, a few minutes. That was how close the reading had been. That close. And in the space of a single morning, the enemy, who had ruled the Pacific for 6 months, lost the heart of his striking force. 6 months, almost to the day after the harbor burned, the fleet that everyone had written off broke the back of the Navy that had beaten it. Roosevelt's choice had been made in a room in Washington over the objections of nearly everyone. Now it had been answered on the open sea. The quiet man had not merely held the line. He had turned the war, and he was not finished. Let no one tell you the hard part was over. Midway broke the enemy's momentum, but it did not break his will. What lay ahead was 3 more years of the bitterest fighting America has ever known. Long, grinding, bloody years, island after island, each one paid for in the lives of young men who would never see home again. The easy story would end at Midway, on the high note, with the trumpets. The true story kept going, into a fight that asked everything of the men who waged it. And through all of it, at the center of it, was the same quiet Texan, planning, deciding, carrying the weight, never once losing the certainty he had voiced on the deck of that submarine when everyone else had given up hope. The months became years, and the years carried the fleet Nimitz had rebuilt across thousands of miles of ocean, island by island, closer and closer to the enemy's own shores. He fought that long campaign the way he did everything, without waste, without cruelty, sparing his men where he could. The enemy held hundreds of islands scattered across the vast Pacific, each one turned into a fortress, each one bristling and waiting. A lesser commander might have felt bound to take them all, to grind through every garrison, at a cost in American lives too terrible to imagine. Nimitz would not do it. He picked the islands that mattered, the ones that carried his fleet forward, and he simply went around the rest. He cut them off. He left the enemy's proudest strongholds to wither behind him, their guns pointed at an ocean that had already passed them by. It saved thousands of American boys who would otherwise have died taking ground that did not need taking. And there was a quieter miracle underneath the whole advance, one that traced straight back to the young submarine officer he'd once been. Years before the war, when the rest of the Navy paid it little mind, Nimitz had been one of the men who worked out how to refuel and resupply a warship at sea from another ship without ever returning to port. It seemed a small, technical thing then. It was not small. It was the secret engine of the entire Pacific campaign. Because of the work he had done decades earlier, his fleet could stay at sea almost without end, striking 1,000 miles from any harbor, then 1,000 miles farther, never having to turn back. The enemy could not understand how the Americans were always there, always fed, always fueled, always coming. The answer was a piece of unglamorous engineering that a young Chester Nimitz had helped invent a lifetime before, never dreaming what it would one day carry. The broken harbor became the launching point for the greatest naval force the world has ever seen. Before the end, the quiet personnel officer who had once thought himself too junior to command a single fleet would direct more than 2 million men and women, 5,000 ships, and 20,000 aircraft. More power than any commander in the history of his country had ever held in his hands. Until at last, on a September morning in 1945, it ended where it had to end, in a bay off the enemy's capital, aboard a mighty American battleship. A battleship, this time, with a deck broad enough for the whole world to watch. The surrender was signed. The decks were crowded that morning. Sailors hung from every railing and gun mount to see it. Boys who had grown up in the years since Pearl Harbor and won a war on the way. The enemy's officers came aboard in silence, in their formal black, and the whole weight of 4 terrible years pressed down on that quiet stretch of water. And when the moment came for the United States to put its name to the end of the war, it was Chester Nimitz who stepped forward. The quiet Texan, the personnel officer, the man 28 admirals had stood above 4 years before. He took up the pen and signed, without a speech, without a flourish, the way he had done everything. And with that single signature, the war in the Pacific was over. He had begun on the deck of a submarine because the enemy had left him nothing better to stand on. He ended on the deck of a battleship because he had built a navy that could not be stopped. Franklin Roosevelt did not live to see it. He had died months before, with the hardest fighting in the Pacific still underway, never knowing for sure that the strange bet he made in the darkest week of the war had come home. But it had. Every ounce of it. The man he had chosen against every objection, the one nobody expected, the one even his own admirals doubted, had carried the whole ocean on his shoulders and set it right. One decision, one room, one quiet man that everybody had passed over. We remember the war in its great moments, the burning harbor, the carriers at Midway, the surrender in the bay. But the war was not won in those moments alone. It was won in 100 quiet choices made by men whose names most of us will never know. The choice to believe when there was no reason to. The choice to trust a beaten man instead of blaming him. The choice to keep going out to sea, week after week, year after year, until the job was done. Chester Nimitz made those choices. So did the men under him. So, in their own way, did the men who fought and the families who waited at home with the lights turned low. That is the thing about the men who won that war. So many of them were not the ones you would have picked. They were not the loudest or the flashiest or the ones whose names filled the papers. They were steady men, quiet men, men who ran their first ship aground and were given another chance, men who held on when holding on was hard, and who did the right thing when no one was watching to applaud it. Men who trusted others because someone had once trusted them. You know men like that, or you knew them. They did not talk much about what they had done. They came home and they went to work, and they raised their families, and they kept the hardest parts to themselves. But every so often, if you were lucky, one of them would say something, at a kitchen table, on a back porch, late in the evening, when the room had gone quiet. Somewhere in your family, there may be a man who lived a piece of this. A father, a grandfather. A story he told at the dinner table that never made it into any book. A name, a ship, a night he couldn't forget. Those stories are disappearing, one by one, every year. If you carry one of them, leave it in the comments below. Let it live a little longer. Don't let it vanish.